Because I'm situated at the intersection of social science and trying to think about certain processes that seem important, and practical concerns with things like health care delivery, trying to find ways to inform healthcare with the best available anthropological knowledge and perspectives has been an interest of mine since my earliest career. As I mentioned, when I was in training at the University of California, Davis in psychiatry, Byron Good and Mary Jo Good were there, and with a psychiatrist, Hank Herrera, they started a cultural consultation clinic that brought in some patients and local healers, with the idea that the local healer would provide some assessment and intervention. So as residents, we watched a Mexican curandero, a Puerto Rican espiritista, a Baptist minister come to the clinic and, working with different patients from their own background, try to offer help to people. And we were sort of watching this as an alternate form of healing, as something complementary to what we were doing. When I came back to Montreal, I worked at the Jewish General Hospital in a neighborhood where 65% of the people in that urban inner city neighborhood were born outside the country. So huge immigrant neighborhood, huge diversity, people from 80, 90 different countries. So it defeats the idea that you have in the U.S. where diversity in the United States is framed in terms of, has been for a long time, was framed in terms of these 5 ethno-racial blocks that the U.S. Census measured. You could be African American, Asian American, or Pacific Islander, which is half the world's population, American Indian, Alaska Native, Latino, Hispanic, or now Latino, or white or Caucasian. I mean, these are weird categories. They are artifacts of the census. They are different. One is linguistic, reflecting colonialism. One is racialized, reflecting slavery. One is geographic, reflecting, migration. So they're a kind of a weird combination. They don't work precisely anywhere. They don't work precisely in the U.S. They don't work precisely anywhere else. In Canada, they don't make much sense. So we have a dilemma, but a consequence of that, though, and the general way people have thought about identity in the U.S., has been that one way to try to deal with difference, cultural difference in clinical services, is ethnic matching. Okay, you're a Hispanic client, we'll get you a Hispanic therapist, psychiatrist. They'll speak your language and they'll know your background and so on. We've published articles in our journal that point out just how crude that is, that you can, yes, you both speak Spanish, you're from different parts of the Southern Hemisphere, and you have huge, different socioeconomic levels, different educational levels, different cultures. Other than, sure, it's great to have the same language up to a point, although you may even speak different versions, different idioms, and there may be plenty of misunderstandings. But it clearly doesn't work in a lot of settings. So we became interested in the idea of trying to use a cultural perspective in the Canadian multicultural context, where we say, okay, everybody's from somewhere, everybody has a different background, we should all be able to occupy the same social space. There's the element of the French Republican ideal that's very strong here in Quebec, which is we should have the same rights and the same ability to participate. And then the multicultural part, which says, and our identity should be acknowledged, should be included in some ways. That's the part that the Republican ideal says, no, that's your private business. The state doesn't have to do that. So that's, in France and in Quebec, the attitude is, diversity is fine, but it's your own business. It's not the state's business. In multiculturalism, the idea is diversity is also the state's business, that the state has an obligation to support that, to make it possible for people to express and live out their identity. So that's the value system that I subscribe to. In some ways, I'm a creature of that system. I grew up benefiting from it, or it emerged at the same time as my own consciousness of my own identity was emerging, I could say. It was designed to partly by Trudeau, by others, as a solution to some of the tensions that exist in Canada between English and French. But it is a vision of Canada that was already a fact. It was talked about in the vertical mosaic. It was talked about in other ways, that we have a high degree of retention of ethnicity and a certain level of acceptance that everybody has a hyphenated identity, French Canadian, English Canadian, Indigenous Canadian, whatever. So the question is, what does that look like in terms of a health service? Because we don't have the expertise to respond to everybody, especially when you're talking about newcomers that we want to welcome and say, fine, you're Cambodian, but I don't speak any Khmer and I barely know any history of Cambodia, so where am I going to do? So the model that we tried to develop, this came out again of an opportunity. Health Canada developed a program they called the Health Transitions Fund, where they wanted to fund projects that would improve continuity of care in primary care. And we said, we came a little bit from left field, but they seemed to buy it. We said, look, we want to develop a consultation service model that provides consultation to primary care centered on questions of culture. So, if you're a family doctor and you're seeing patients, you're doing fine, but now you see a patient has a heart problem and it's a very complicated one. It's not in your usual expertise. So you say, Mr. Jones, I'm going to send you over to see Dr. So-and-so. He's a cardiologist. He'll check this out and he'll let us know what to do. And in that model in Quebec right now, it's not that the cardiologist is supposed to keep that patient. He's supposed to assess the patient, send it back to the family doctor with a report saying, okay, I think Mr. So-and-so has such and such a problem. I suggest the following medication, et cetera, et cetera. Let me know if you need help later on, kind of, basically. That's one model. I mean, there can be different degrees of involvement. Anyway, we said, could we apply that to culture? Could we say, you're a mental health practitioner, you're seeing a patient, you think, my God, I don't understand what's going on here. I don't, I need help. Can you refer the patient saying, what I need help with is the cultural aspects of this case? So we developed a service. We trained ourselves in the process to try to figure out how to do this. And this started in 1999, I think? Yeah, 1999, 2000. And we've now seen about 1,000 cases in that context. We've written a book about it, describing it, and it's quite a fascinating process. And we record many of the consultations to look at what difference does culture make, or what difference do people claim that culture makes. What is culture in this context? And we had early on a very interesting experience, which is worth recounting in this anthropological context, because the model again was, who's going to be the consultant? We have general knowledge. We have the outline for cultural formulation in DSM-4, and now the cultural formulation interview in DSM-5. So we have some general tools, but how do we figure this out? And so we invited sometimes an anthropologist. So let's say an anthropologist who works in West Africa. We have a West African immigrant. We've been asked to consult on them. We'll get an anthropologist who works in West Africa. So the first problem is, if they only work in West Africa, they don't necessarily have the knowledge we need, because this is a person here and now in Montreal, and we need to know not only what is the tradition over there. Usually our other problem is you get the ethnographic past. So what was the tradition 50 years ago when this beautiful ethnography was written? We need to know what's it like last year when this person left, and what's it like for this person or this community here now, here in our place. So that's a different thing. So we did find some anthropologists who do that, who know people there, who know people here, and who are interested in migration, interested in so they could do a wonderful interview with the psychiatrist present or whatever, and really get all kinds of information, or not even see the patient, without even interviewing the patient, tell us, look, here's some background that you should know that might be helpful, and give very detailed things. In these early consultations, we would have that kind of information, and we call those people a culture broker in a way, because they're bridging our understanding of culture, and sometimes that's a two-way street, that they're going to explain the culture to us, and then we're going to explain our culture or our expectations to the patient. But we would invite the referring clinician to come. So Dr. So-and-so, if you'd like, you can come to this meeting where we're going to present the information. And I remember some of those early meetings where particularly some of the doctors who worked with the refugee clinics, so they were very interested and they were very concerned, and they would give the time it took to come a few blocks away to this other meeting and sit for an hour and hear about it way more than they would usually be able to do. And what was interesting is the anthropologist gave this nuanced, 3 or 4 pages of dense information, and as they were doing that, the the referring clinician would go through being first fascinated and then kind of getting glassy-eyed, like they were going into a trance, because it was so complicated for them point of view, and it had no, it was just overwhelming. So that was interesting in terms of the dilemma you mentioned. Ethnographers are trained to do ethnography, to do rich, nuanced, multi-layered accounts. Clinicians are trained to take a few notes and get to the point. What do we need to do? So what's interesting in that same meeting, I think of one particular episode, at the end, the doctor said, "Oh, that's fascinating. It's very interesting. Okay, so what do I do?" And then the ethnographer went into a trance. It's like, because this is way beyond what they are asked to do. And in fact, it was painful to think about that, because they would feel like, well, almost anything you do is going to be problematic, maybe. So what we found was we all had to retrain ourselves. The clinicians had to retrain to how to begin to take in some of this and use it to think about things in context. And the anthropologist consultant had to start thinking as a problem solver. Okay, practically speaking, which piece will work? So that's been what's going on in a very interesting way, this back and forth and trying to make sense. One consequence of this work, aside from some very interesting pieces of work around when do we re-diagnose psychosis, what leads to misdiagnosis of psychosis, important questions in mental health, has also been the development, the refinement of this cultural formulation interview. So in DSM-4, which is or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual in general of the American Psychiatric Association, is a major tool, if you will, or technology of psychiatry. With DSM-4, there was an effort to include culture in a systematic way. So a group of about 100 people were brought together in 1993 in Pittsburgh, and Arthur Kleinman, many other people, 3 Canadians, myself, Ellen Corin, and Morton Beiser took part in this meeting. And that group went on to write a shadow report, a parallel report to the development of the DSM, with suggestions for every diagnosis and how it could incorporate culture. That resulted in some text in the DSM-4 that included culture, and it resulted in an outline for cultural formulation, which was developed by Byron Good and some others, which was basically a set of topics that should be considered when you're trying to think about a mental health problem in cultural context. And that included the identity of the person, which could include their languages and their ethnicity and so on. It included it shows you how tired I am that I'm not remembering something very basic right now. Okay. The identity of the person, it included their understandings of the illness, their explanatory models, and it included the stressors and supports that they had in relation to their cultural framework. Certain things are stressful because there's a certain expectation that a man or a woman or an elder or a young person is supposed to do or not do certain things, and so on. And then the nature of the clinician-patient relationship. What's the expectation the person has of what should a healer be? How should this person, relate to me? So that was just an outline that was produced coming into DSM-4. For many years, it was not used by people. We did a study we used it in our cultural consultation service, and whenever we had a consultant, we asked them if they were familiar with this and if they had used it, and we found that most people were not familiar, even though it was there in the DSM because it was right at the back. With DSM-5, there was a different dynamic around the inclusion of culture. There was not a culture committee. There was a sex and gender and whatever committee, but it then included culture. And Roberto Luis Fernandez, a psychiatrist who did a postdoc with Arthur Kleinman and a master's in divinity and did this cultural psychiatry postdoc, led a process that involved many of us. And we developed both a lot of refinements of the text of DSM-4 that talk about culture differently, we hope more in a more au courant way, and also a cultural formulation interview. And the cultural formulation interview, which is only 16 questions, is just a very simple way to say to mental health practitioners, here's a way to begin to get a sense from the person of what they think is going on, of what other people around them think is going on. So it's the very basics of sort of contextualizing health. And now there's an increasing body of work going on trying to see what difference does it make if you do this. Do people feel listened to? Do they feel understood? Do they get to raise issues that would not come up otherwise? And that's an ongoing process. The next steps in this, I think, are going to be how to incorporate structural issues, because This is good at getting a conversation going around the person's own perspective, but of course people are embedded in social worlds that they are not fully aware of, that are hard to articulate for very obvious reasons. Sometimes they know, but they don't want to talk about it. Like they're experiencing racism, they don't feel it's safe to talk about it. So that's one challenge. But sometimes it's structural issues of disadvantage, gender roles, whatever, that people have not even thought about particularly, but they're actually quite relevant to what they're dealing with. So that's an unfinished piece of work in all this endeavor. So it's an interesting opportunity in a way to bring the power and the perspective of anthropology to bear on enriching mental health practice, always with this tension that I mentioned already, that the richness, the very richness and depth and sometimes the ambiguity that is important in anthropology, to be truthful to what's going on, has to be focused and selected from to provide practical tools when the agenda is to intervene. Although sometimes the conclusion may be the best thing to do is not to intervene, and that's okay too if the solution is leave it alone. For example, we've had consultations where a psychiatrist asks us to see their patient because the young man, let's say, has psychosis and the family wants to take him to a traditional healer, take him back to his home country traditional healer, and the psychiatrist is very anxious that doesn't make sense and he won't take his medicine and he'll get sick and so on. So our intervention might be to talk to everybody and then say, this doesn't need to be either or. This family likes you, they trust you, but they want to, look, wouldn't you try everything if it was your child and they weren't getting better? Why should they not do this? So then just to say, fine, so then we can create a little more pluralistic space within certain bounds for something to happen. So it's one simple example of what goes on in this work. I think, as I say, we're in a different moment right now where issues of racism have come to the fore. In Canada, we've been very reluctant to talk about that. We've treated ourselves as somehow, we're more accepting or more tolerant and ignored the ways in which we have structural and systemic racism throughout our society, as most societies do. So now we have a will to begin to engage with this, and we had a call to action following the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. We had a call to action in the Canadian Journal of Psychiatry, and now we've completed a report led by Eric Jarvis, a cultural psychiatrist, on taking action on racism and structural violence in psychiatry. So with a lot of very concrete recommendations, many of which have to do with simply ensuring that people are aware of the history, aware of the different experience of somebody, a person of color, whatever. That, for me, this came home very clearly years ago when I was working with a student who was Haitian Canadian, and who told me that when she goes to the department store with her daughter, it's very painful for her because she's followed around by a plainclothes detective. And for me, growing up in the same society, going to the same store, this was a shocking statement. I didn't realize that there was such a person. I didn't realize that if you had dark skin, that you would be profiled when you walk in the store as a potential shoplifter and be followed around. And it only takes a bit of empathy to say, if this was me, if this was my child, I would be humiliated, I would be furious, I would feel, what kind of a society is this? So this is stuff that it's been here all along, but we have not come to grips with it properly. So I think it's a very important moment right now, and it's one of the things anthropology has been very closely allied with and struggled with itself, but all along, in terms of trying to help understand how human difference is framed in ways that perpetrate violence against each other. And I think it's a good moment for us to be thinking this through. One of the last things that happened with DSM-5, DSM-5-TR, which just came out, the latest revision of this psychiatric nosology, was there was a small group of people, I was privileged to be part of that, who went through the entire text looking for every mention of race, ethnicity, culture, and asking whether the vocabulary and the way it's framed is acceptable given our current awareness. So one of the things we introduced was, rather than using the word race all the time, can we use the word racialized? Because that forces people to recognize that race is not a natural thing in the world, it's a thing we do because of our social and cultural categories, that we divide people up in certain ways. So that little bit of, by using an awkward phrasing, doing a little bit of consciousness raising, is an example of what I think can come from a social science perspective and begin to influence some of these institutions and other domains that otherwise operate a little bit without awareness of this larger context.